Dear Lord, I just thank you for this morning. I thank you for the chance that we have to meet together, to learn from each other, and to grow. Lord, I just pray that you would meet with everybody here, that you would speak to our hearts, Lord, that you would help us to love you more, that you would help us to better understand your world, Lord, that you would transform us and help us to become more like you. And we just thank you so much for your love and your patience with us. And it's in your name we pray. Amen. Um, all right. So for those of you who have been here, um, if you looked at the description of the course, which was like loving God's world, hopefully your response is something like, boy, this has been good and I appreciate it. But why did you title this Loving God's World? Why have we been talking about issues with anti-intellectualism? Why have we been talking about reading and about knowledge? I thought that's not what I think of usually. Um, and so I want to just kind of recap what we're doing and where we're going. In some sense, we're kind of like dividing the class into two. The first part is what I would consider like very foundational issues. And then the second part is us going to be looking at more and more specific parts of God's world. So this is kind of like a transition lecture. So let me talk a little bit about what we've been doing. One of the things that I really think is right is that there's a two-way relationship between love and knowledge, right? If you love someone, then you're drawn to know them, right? You want to find out what their hobbies are. You want to find out what their interests are. You could just imagine kind of like all the love stories. A guy sees a girl and he wants to get to know her, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's a relationship between this here. If you love something, then you want to know more about it. And also, if you know something and it's good, right? You don't find out that it's some terrible, awful thing, but you know it and it's a good thing, then you're drawn to love it, right? We're just naturally drawn to love what is good. And so you see this relationship here. Like as you get to know something more and more, assuming that it's good, you start to love it more and more and become more interested and attracted in it. And the same thing, if you love something, the more and more you love it, the more and more you want to get to know it, right? And so I felt like some of these problems that we were looking at about anti-intellectualism, about the problems in our culture that are narcissistic, that's lazy, that's also unintellectual, that's focused on money and stuff like that. These are really barriers to us knowing and loving God's world, right? Because they attack that aspect of knowledge, they attack that aspect of us loving it, right? And they say something like, us loving it is unimportant, or we can't possibly know it, or that's not something that we're called to do. And so we don't understand that we're missing the beauty of the world sometimes about how God created this wonderful, amazing world that's incredibly complicated. And you guys remember the story of MacArthur Wheeler? He was a guy that tried to rob the bank by putting lemon juice on his face and then thought that he wouldn't show up on the cameras because, lemon juice is used for invisible ink, right? So he thought like, oh, the police wouldn't find him and stuff. So he's incompetent and he's unaware that he's incompetent. And there's a sort of thing in which we go around and we miss the beauty of the world and we don't even realize that we're missing it. We don't even know what it is that we're missing. And so our ignorance, it can hide us from failures and it can hide the wonderful, beautiful world that exists. We just wind up becoming blind to it and distracted by our phones, right? We become distracted by technology. We get caught up in that busy race. That was one of the things that we talked about our culture, just trying to get us to go, 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 to be hurried, to always be distracted, to constantly be entertained, right? These are all things, again, that just get in the way of us knowing God's world and us loving it. And also, our having knowledge and understanding the world was planned for us by God, and it was mandated by Him, right? So it's part of the good that he created. If you think about it, he made us as reasoning beings. I talked a while back about, right, like animals right after they're born are largely independent. They can go, they can live, they know what to do, and they do it off of instinct. Human babies, not so much. Of an animal will almost, I don't think there's probably any examples to this, that after 1 year, that animal would not be entirely independent. And a 1-year-old baby is not independent in any way, shape, or form, right? A 3-year-old isn't independent. We are not meant to run off of instinct. We are meant to run off of knowledge, off of understanding. It's how God made us, and that's a wonderful thing. There's a psalm, I can't remember exactly what it is, but God is saying, don't be like the animals that have to be controlled by a bridle. Gain knowledge, gain understanding, right? That's the way that we're meant to live and to operate in the world. And so what is it that God does? He creates this wonderful world. He places Adam in it. He gives him the ability to think and to reason and to learn. And he tells him, go have dominion over the world. Go understand it. Go control it. Right? What is one of the things that Adam should have gone and done? He should have gone and learned about what different types of soil there are, which ones are good for growing which kinds of food, how to make the soil better, right? Agricultural work is something that Adam was called to do. And you see, like very early on, people start doing all of that. Do you know, I might talk about this later, but do you know what the most foundational of all sciences is? The naming of things, right? Somebody discovers a new animal, what's the first thing they do? Slap a name on that sucker, right? If somebody comes up with like, oh, we just discovered this new subatomic particle, what's the first thing that they do? Slap a name on it. Taxonomy, naming, is the most foundational science. What's the first thing that Adam does in the garden? Names things. He names the animals, right? That's the foundation of science, really. And so I really felt like it was important to kind of point out these errors, to repeat God's good plan, and hopefully like the 2 lessons on knowledge and reading were a way of like explaining what those are so that you would better know knowledge itself and then be drawn to love it more, so that you would see the good that it has. The wonderful witness that just being a knowledgeable, competent person can have, right? And we talked about that Philippians 2 section. Yeah, Dave. Thank you.
Just when you were talking about that, I was thinking about the quote, I think it's by Thomas Jefferson, but an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people.
Yeah.
It's kind of like it doesn't work if you're led around by a bridle,
Yeah. It's very, very true. Thank you. Let's see here. Yeah, these aspects of knowledge and stuff are just very important, and hopefully as we've looked at them, we've gotten to know them better and then to love them more. And I think that there are some shared problems between what we kind of call that like fundamentalism, that anti-intellectualism and stuff in our secular culture. And one of the main problems is that knowledge is neither known nor is it loved, right? And so we talked a little bit about like there was a bunch of really crummy thinking that came on the scenes in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the 1800s. And one of the things that Christians did, instead of engaging with it, becoming more knowledgeable, they withdrew. And when they withdrew, they conceded, right? And so secular culture grew and developed. And I think part of what we need to do is to fight that back, is to become knowledgeable in these areas, right? So it's kind of like a problem that both of these share. And what's happened in our culture as Christianity withdrew and receded is we found out that like, well, it's very hard to have knowledge, to have values and stuff without God, right? So I guess we just don't have it. We'll just chuck that out the window. And so again, like what I've been trying to do is to get us to see the goodness and beauty of knowledge and of reading and of pursuing it. And of course, what's going to happen as you pursue knowledge and reading and stuff, you're going to learn about God's world. That's the hopeful part, right? You're going to learn about different aspects of it. Some of you will maybe be drawn to history. Some of you will maybe be drawn to theology. Some of you will maybe be drawn into just understanding literature, great works of literature and stuff. But that's all part of God's world, you know. God created the idea of novels, right? He created the idea of art. He created the idea of trees and atoms, right? He's the person that's responsible for all of those things. And when we learn about it and we enjoy it, that's us learning about God's world, right? And so to talk again kind of about the overall structure of the class, after we've kind of talked about like these foundational things about the problem that we're facing and then how to combat it with knowledge and reading, two of the big things that I've kind of been talking about. And there's other issues, but I can't talk about everything. So what we're going to do today is just kind of talk about the world at large, just the big picture, what's true everywhere. And then we're going to talk about the sciences. You can just think like physics, chemistry, biology. Those are probably the best and clearest examples of what a science is, right? We're going to talk about that area. Then we'll talk about the humanities. Those are things like literature, history, religion, philosophy. These are all things that concern people. Atoms don't concern people in the same sort of way, right? At least not the lives of people. And so you can see why this is kind of called the humanities. And then we're going to talk about the arts, things like painting, music, movies, architecture, those sorts of things. So the plan is big picture, and then to look at each one of these little details, and that'll take up the rest of the course. Let me just talk about the world at large. This is kind of the main idea that I want to present to you this morning. Our world is very complicated. It is very complex. And there's lots of different problems and different questions that we have. So I think I told you, like, some of this is kind of adapted from stuff that I used to talk about at Liberty. One of the things that happens when people go to college is they call it the freshman 15. Most freshmen gain on average 15 pounds when they first go to college. And the question is, why? Why does that happen? Are they eating out more often? Are they sitting and reading more? Is that what's happening? Aren't they running around and playing sports? You know, is the food less healthy at colleges? Is that the problem? They're not getting as much home cooked meals? Or is the food more healthy, but it's also very cheap and free and it's unlimited, right? Because they have things like cafeterias. And it doesn't so much concern the quality, but it concerns the quantity. You know, what is it? What's going on here? That's a question that we can have. And you can think about how we would answer that, right? Would we ask freshmen probably like, how do you feel? Why do you feel like you've gained 15 pounds? That's probably not going to give us the best answers, right? If, on the other hand, we went to a bunch of high school students and we said, how many home cooked meals are you eating? What's your diet like? How often do you go for walks? How much exercise do you get? And then we ask those same questions of college students. Well, that'll be helpful. That's a good way of answering that question. That'll make a little bit of progress. Right? You could see something like that might work too. Like we have some new medication and we want to know, will it lower someone's blood pressure? Are we going to ask that person questions about their feelings? Do you feel like your blood pressure is lower since you started taking this medicine? No. What are we going to do? We're going to measure it before they take their medication, and we're going to measure it after they take their medication, right? That's what we're going to do. Now think about this question. Will this medicine lower someone's anxiety? Are we going to ask them about their feelings there? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're going to have to do that, right? You can't approach these first two questions the same way that you approach this third question. Our world is very complicated. There's no one way of answering all the questions that we have. Or, you know, there's a document, it was called the Magna Carta. And it was, to some extent, like, it's probably the most influential political document in the world. So there's a King Charlemagne, and if I'm remembering my history correctly, right, he kind of starts up setting these rules. those rules get carried over into England, British common law, then is incredibly influential in US political law, right? So a lot of laws and stuff in all of Europe, England, and America trace back to here. What is the significance of the Magna Carta? Are we going to ask Charlemagne what his feelings were? It's not really an option, is it? Right? We don't get to do that. Right? Are we going to take some sort of measurement like what we did with blood pressure? That's kind of tricky, isn't it? How would we do that? You see, there's all sorts of different problems, interesting things, and we can't approach it the same way. Or another example is like, we could ask this question, what happens when a man is in love, right? And you could maybe talk about like when he sees a girl that he likes, he starts to sweat and his palms get a little sweaty and his heart rate goes up and maybe certain chemicals get released in his brain and he starts to feel certain things. And there's lots of different ways of approaching this question. Let's look at this statement here about what happens when somebody is in love. Oxytocin has been identified as an important neurochemical substrate of attachment and affiliation, a 9-amino acid peptide that asserts its effects peripherally. Oops, that wasn't supposed to come up yet. That asserts its effects peripherally as a hormone. Oxytocin has been implicated in various physiological processes, including childbirth, lactation, and thermoregulation. Study. Oxytocin, however, also acts centrally to a neuromodulator influencing social cognition and behavior related to attachment, bonding, social memory, caretaking, and parenting. This is called the hormone of love. If there was an alien and he knew nothing about love and said, what does it feel like to be in love? And you told him this, would he be like, oh, got it? Right? How many of you ladies would like to receive a Valentine's card with that on it? You have raised my oxytocin levels by 14 parts per million. Right? But that's something that happens to people, isn't it? Right? We are physical. In a sense, you could kind of think of us as amphibians. We have a spiritual aspect, but we also have a biological, a physical aspect. And so when we love somebody, things happen in our bodies, and that talks about what happens in our bodies. And that's important. But it's not the whole picture, is it? And it leaves out an awful lot. I don't know why this keeps advancing randomly. Anyways, it was time for this one to come up. What about this? Let's look at this about what it feels like when a man is in love. This is a sonnet by Shakespeare. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impedance. Love is not love, which alters when it alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. Oh no, it is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Love's not time's fool, though rosy lips and cheeks within his bending sickle's compass come, love alters not with his brief hours and weeks, but bears it out even to the edge of doom. If this be error and upon me proved, I never writ, nor no man ever loved. How many of you ladies would like something like that on your Valentine's Day card, right? It's a little bit different, right? This feelings of no matter what, I will stick close to you. I will love you. I will choose you above everything else. In trials and troubles and tribulations and tempests, I will not be shaken. I will always pursue your good, right? When time makes it so that your rosy lips and cheeks aren't quite like what they were 30 years ago, it does not matter. My love for you will not change, right? That tells us something about love that oxytocin could never tell us about love, right? And so us, again, as people are kind of a helpful example here, right? There's no single way of understanding a person. We have feelings that just simply are not able to be investigated scientifically, right? And we also have body functions and body parts that go on that have to be investigated scientifically. We need both of these. There's no single way of approaching the world. Our world is incredibly complicated. Right. And so what all of this hopefully kind of helps us to establish is that reality is what I like to call multifaceted. Multifaceted is just a fancy pants word for saying it has lots of different surfaces, lots of different faces on it. So you can think of like a diamond, right? It has all of these different surfaces on it, and that's part of its beauty. That's part of what makes it sparkle and shine, is that it has all of these different surfaces on it. Part of what makes our world so beautiful and wonderful is that it's very complicated and it has all of these different aspects to it. But we need to recognize that and recognize that because of that, there's no single way of approaching every issues. And a lot of issues have multiple sides to it, right? So again, we're amphibians, we're part spiritual, we're part physical. If I smack you on the head hard enough, it will affect your thinking. It'll affect your thinking because you'll stop thinking, right? Physical stuff affects mental things, but mental stuff is also important, right? If somebody is dealing with depression and anxiety, we need to look and to consider medication. There could be a physical thing that's going on here, and we should not disdain that. And at the same time, there might be other things that are going on, spiritual things, mental things, life choices, choosing to look at the world a certain way that are having negative effects as well, right? There's a two-way relationship here, right? If you think about certain stuff, your body will affect in a certain way. If you start thinking about being in danger, guess what? Your heart rate will increase, adrenaline will start to pump, right? Your body will be affected. At the same way, if we affect your body, right, smacking you in the head hard enough or something, it'll affect your thinking. Both of those go both ways. And so we need to not disdain any particular way of looking at the world. And we need to recognize that we need all of this. Now, what I'm going to call disciplines, those are just the three things that I mentioned earlier: science, the humanities, and the arts. Those are the three main disciplines. Those are specially geared at getting at some aspects of reality. Because reality is complicated, because we can't get at it a single way, we have multiple disciplines, and the sciences are really good at getting at the physical part. And that's what they're geared to get at, but they don't get at other things. And the humanities are really good at getting at human experience. And the arts, which are really kind of a subset of the humanities, are really good at talking about beauty, right? A specific aspect of the world. And we need all three of those. And really, it's because the world is complicated, it's because of the nature of the world that determines the methods by which we understand it. Let me kind of give some examples here. So think about the nature of the physical universe. It just exists. It just is. God made it in a certain way that it lends itself towards quantification. That just means putting it in terms of numbers. If I talk to you about time, what do? We talk about numbers of seconds, numbers of minutes, numbers of hours, days, weeks. If I talk to you about space, what is it that we do? We break it up into little numerical chunks. And we talk about inches, number of feet, number of yards, number of barley corns. Does anybody know barley corns? A barley corn is a third of an inch. And actually, it is applicable to something that every one of you currently has. Shoes, shoe sizes. One shoe size is one barley corn. That's a third of an inch. That was how they did it originally, was they used barley corn, a third of an inch, right? So if we talk about time, what do? We break it up into little numerical chunks. If we talk about space, what do? We break it up into little numerical chunks. If we talk about matter, stuff, what do? We break it up into little numerical chunks. And we talk about ounces, we talk about pounds, kilograms, those sorts of things, right? Time, matter, space, energy, the whole physical world just lends itself towards quantification. If I ask you something about how long was that movie, you're going to give me a numerical answer. You're going to say it was 121 minutes. You're going to convert it into a numerical answer. However, not all of the world is like that. The nature of value, of meaning, of love, of even things like contradiction and many other things do not lend themselves towards quantification. For those of you who have kids, what is the value of your children? How many units of value do they possess? What is the measurement? Okay, there's not a specific number. What's our measurement for value? We know what our measurements of time are. We know what our measurements of mass are. We know what our measurements of energy is. We know what our measurements of space is. What about measurements of value? Value does not lend itself towards quantification. That's not how it works, right? There is no value that we can place on our children. It's not that sort of thing, right? The same thing is true for like meaning, or again, we can't say like the Magna Carta has 37 units of significance, right? And why is it that we laugh? Because we realize to try and even put it in a numerical term is just wrong. It's wrong-headed. It's the wrong way of looking at the world. Oh, I think actually I was supposed to have this slide up for part of that discussion, right? So like time, matter, space, and energy, these are all things that we can put into numerical units. And I want to make a little bit of a distinction between what I'll call the universe and the world. The universe is just the physical world. The world is everything that exists, okay? So stars, planets, galaxies, that's all part of the universe. Atoms, watts, right? Little chunks of atoms, that's all part of the physical universe. Love is not part of the physical universe, but it exists. It's a thing. It's part of the world. The universe is characterized by the fact that it's open to quantification, and it's also objective. It's kind of public in a way. And I know I have some like kind of, again, fancy pants words up here. It's sense perceptible. What's that mean? It means you can poke it. That chair, you can poke it. You can see it. If you drop it, you can hear it. You can lick it and taste it. I wouldn't recommend it, but you can, right? It's open to our senses. Even little tiny things that we can't see with our eyes, we can use a magnifying glass or a microscope and we can see it. Little things that are very far away that we can't see, well, we can use a telescope for that and we can see those sorts of things. It's open to our senses. And it's like public, right? It's not like I can see that chair, but nobody else can see it. Mm-hmm. This is my private chair. Nobody has access to it. Only I can touch it. It's like, no, everybody can touch it, right? That's even true for our bodies, for our physical bodies, right? Guess what? You can touch my finger. And you can do other things to my finger. That's probably not a good example, right? But you get the point, right? You can use your senses to investigate my finger or my body, right? It's just public. Nobody has any sort of privileged access to it, and impersonal laws govern it and control it, right? Things like gravity, those are the things that govern and control the physical universe. The world, though, is much bigger. So one way of thinking about it, there were some markers up here earlier. One way of thinking about it is this is the world, everything that exists. And this is the universe. Just going to write uni. Right? So the universe is part of the world, but there are things that exists outside of it. My thoughts. Guess what? You can't poke those. You can't smell those. You can't lick my thoughts. And guess what? I do have special privileged access to those. And nobody else can see my thoughts. And even if you cut my head open and you look at my brain, you'll never find my thoughts in there. Right? Not all of the world is this like kind of public, objective, and open to the senses. Part of it is, but not all of it. Some aspects of the world are public. Some aspects of it are private. All of the private aspects are outside of science. We're going to talk more about this next week. But I just kind of want to introduce us to that concept. This is what science looks at. It looks at these sorts of things. Anything that is private is outside of the domain of science. But there's also some public things that are still outside of the physical universe. Guess what? The number 2, I don't have special privileged access to that. It's not like I can think about 2 and you can't. But you know what? 2 isn't made up of matter. 2 isn't like slightly lighter than 3, right? They don't have mass. They don't have space. They're immaterial. They're not part of the physical universe, but nevertheless, they're still like public. They're still things that all of us can think about. So math, logic, different other fancy things, even things like value, beauty, these are things that are public, but non-physical, okay? They're not part of the universe, but everybody has access to it. There are other private things that we have, my thoughts, my feelings. Those are things that I have special privileged private access to. The thing is, right, if we want to test our medication, we find out if it's helping out with anxiety, right? We're asking about somebody's feelings, something that's private. And so we can't poke them with a probe and find out what their feelings are. Right? We have to ask them. And that's why we have to use a different method for it. So again, like what I'm trying to say, our world is very complicated. There's no single way of looking at it. Because it's complicated, we've kind of divided it up into different disciplines. And science is like, I'll look at the physical parts and I'm going to investigate that and do the best that I can there. And the humanities are like, I'm going to look at people, what they did, what their culture was like. I'm going to look at those sorts of things. And the arts focuses on beauty and that part. And it's kind of divided the world up. But not any one of those has a single view of the entire world. So we can't approach reality in a single way. Therefore, we need multiple disciplines or sciences. And I want to talk about that term here, science. When I say science now, again, you guys think physics, chemistry, biology, something like that. That's actually slightly more recent. For a long time, things like art would have been a science. Religion would have been a science. Philosophy was a science. Theology was a science. It wasn't just the physical sciences. And so I want to kind of introduce us to that idea because I think it's important, especially for a problem that we're going to look at in a minute. So I want to give kind of a broader definition of science. What is it that sciences are about? What makes something a science? And I want to list 4 things here. And I should kind of say, I've stolen this list of 4 things from Dallas Willard. The 2 people I like to quote, Dallas Willard and C.S. Lewis. I've kind of stolen this list from him, but I think he's exactly right here. Sciences are about a certain quality of work, the careful analysis of problems, methods, and assumptions, attention to facts and description of phenomena, and the elimination of vagueness. Let me go through each one of those. I'm actually going to start at the bottom, talking about vagueness, right? So, first of all, think about like you're running a science experiment, right? And you say, I dropped this heavy object, and man, it fell fast. It fell really fast. That's like, that's not very good. What do you mean by fast, right? That's not specific. What if I say something like, I dropped a heavy object and it fell at 10 meters a second per second, and it continued to increase at that rate? That's specific, right? So one of the things that sciences do is they use words in a very specific way. That's again why taxonomy, the naming of things, is so important and so foundational. It's also why if you pick up a book on art theory or physics, you're going to go, I don't know what that word means. I don't know what that word means. I don't know what that word means, right? You're all of a sudden confronted with all of these words that you don't know. And it's because they're trying to be very, very clear. And they're having to make distinctions that we don't normally have to make in everyday conversation, right? If we're just randomly talking about how fast something fell, I might be able to say, oh, it fell really fast. It's like, okay, that's good enough, right? But if we're trying to understand the world, if we're trying to really get at it, we need to be more specific than that. We need to get rid of like kind of the ambiguities, the unclearness, the vagueness that's there. My brother and my cousin are both like really into cars, and they both worked as mechanics and they know cars really well. And my cousin had recently purchased a new vehicle, and he mentioned that he had 2 sets of wheels for his car, and so he was thinking about getting another set of tires to go on the other set of wheels. And I was like, I do not know what you were talking about. Tires and wheels are the same thing. They're the roundy thing that's on the car that makes it move forward. How can you get a set of wheels for your wheels or tires for your tires? Like, that doesn't make any sense to me. I don't see how you can get wheels for your tires. And of course, some of you are laughing because it's like, yeah, the tire is the rubber part on the outside, and the wheel is the metal part that's on the middle, right? But I didn't know that, right? And if you've like ever gotten a flat tire, what did you do? You took it off and you put on the spare, what do we call it? Oh, so it's just an extra rubber piece. So what you did is you peeled the other rubber piece off and you put on the spare rubber piece.
Spare wheel.
Yeah, right? We talk about it together, right? We say tires and wheels interchangeably in everyday conversation. When you go to something like your mechanic and you say, order me new tires, or you say, order me a new set of wheels, right? Now, all of a sudden, you need to be specific. You need to be clear about what you mean. Are you talking about the metal part or are you talking about the rubber part? Those are 2 different things, and we have to be clear about it. The reason you have to be clear isn't because like your mechanic is being a jerk, right? And is like, you're not using the right words. It's like, it's not that. It's that the mechanic shop is the place where we take apart cars and we look at them and we try and understand them, right? Sciences are places where we take apart the world and we look at it and we try and understand it. And our language has to be better because of that. And so one of the things that sciences do is they name things and they get rid of vagueness. And that's, again, one of the biggest barriers that we have. But the naming of things is what allows us to pay closer attention to facts and to describe phenomena. If I'm driving my car and like the whole engine just falls out of it, I can go to a mechanic's and kind of say what the problem was. The engine fell out of my car. If it's some little part that broke, I can't even begin to describe the problem. I don't know what the name of that part is. I don't know what it's supposed to do. I can't start to describe the problem if I don't have the language to it. So we start to pay very close attention to facts and to describe things clearly and carefully. Another good example of this is a painting here. Does anybody know who painted it? Van Gogh. It's probably his most famous painting, Starry Night. And if we were to describe what it looked like, we might say, well, it's really like bumpy and it has these ridges to it and it's kind of lumpy. Yeah, that's what it looks like, right? You start to see, because we don't have the right word, there's a lot of vagueness and we can't describe it clearly and carefully. He used a technique that's called impasto. And impasto is when you use thicker paint and you either use a very coarse brush or a putty knife to scrape the paint onto the canvas, right? If you read an art theory book, that's what they're going to do. They're going to give something a term, impasto, to get rid of vagueness. They're going to describe it. They're going to define it. They're going to start doing that. Because we start to do these things with our words and our language, it allows us to carefully analyze problems and to talk about methods and to look at assumptions, right? Again, think about the example of me with the tires and wheels. We realized, wait a minute, you had been assuming that they're all one thing, that they're all one part, but actually it's made up of multiple parts. The same thing is true in the sciences. We start to realize, oh, wait a minute, there's differences between these things. I didn't realize there was differences, right? And it's our language that allows us to do that. And then lastly, there's a certain quality of work, right? So one of the things, if you read like any sort of like academic journal, is there's all of these citations, there's all of these footnotes, right? And that's a way of saying, hey, here's where my information is coming from, right? If you're in a normal conversation, you might say, oh yeah, I remember Abraham Lincoln said such and such, right? And that's perfectly acceptable. In a science where what we're doing is we're very carefully looking at the world, we're trying to get rid of vagueness, we're trying to understand it really well. We want to say, yeah, when did he say that? Where's that written down? I want to be able to double check that. I want to know that he said that, right? If you think like one of the big problems with Facebooks and stuff is like all of these like random quotes and things that are on there. I saw one that somebody did humorously that was like, don't believe everything that you read on the internet. Abraham Lincoln, right? You know, that's the sort of problem that we have, and we want to get rid of that. So we hold things up to a certain quality of work. You have to cite things, you have to show what you read, you have to show what page number it came from, all of these sorts of things. The older way of understanding a science is if it did these things, it's a science, right? Think about theology. What do? We don't just say, you know, the period when the world kind of ends and Jesus comes back and stuff. Eschatology, right? Put a name on it. Eliminate vagueness. You have a theory about how it works? Let's put a name on that, right? Let's carefully describe what it is that we're talking about here. This is true of theology. It's true of art. It's true of the sciences. Anything that does this is a science. And one of the things that I want to push back against is that there's a tendency in our culture to say something like, what we mean by sciences now, the natural sciences, are superior to everything else. And that's really not the case. They all work the same way. They're all doing the same essential things, but they're using appropriate methods, right? One of the major advantages or advances in science was when they started using mathematics and numbers to describe things. That allowed them to be much more precise and to describe things much more clearly and carefully. And advances in science were done that way. But you can do the same sort of thing by using words to get rid of vagueness, to describe things more clearly and carefully. What I want to talk about now is, again, like this major problem that we have, and that is that we try and reduce the world to being simple. Rather than accepting it as complicated and complex, we try and make it very simple and singular and approach it in only one way, right? And so reductionism is what I want to talk about. There's two main instances, scientism and relativism. These are problems that we're going to look at as we go through the class. So I'm just going to introduce them a little bit here, and we'll talk more about them later. But really, what reductionism is about is just the attempt to deny the existence of other approaches to an issue. Say there's only one way of looking at things. Right? So again, it's not when you're excluding other ways. And what I mean by deny versus exclude is when you deny something, you hold that other approaches do not exist or invalid, right? Only science can get at the truth. If you use something other than a quantitative numerical approach, it's not good. It doesn't count. It's just opinion. It's just a guess. It's not knowledge. It's not facts, right? Only science does those things, right? That's a way of denying other approaches or saying that they either just don't exist or they're just totally worthless or invalid. There is advantage, though, to excluding things, right? When we focus on a particular aspect of a problem, because the world is complicated, sometimes we need to say, look, I'm just looking at one issue here, right? Like if we wanted to understand if that blood pressure medicine works, we're not going to ask the people about their feelings. Same thing for testing the anxiety medicine, right? We just want to say, we just want to look at this medication. We don't want the person to go do additional psychiatric treatment, right? Because then maybe it's the psychiatric treatment that's helping and it's not the medication. We just want people, just take the medicine. Don't do anything else. Don't let anything else change. Just change the medicine and see if that works, see if that helps. It's not that those people in that study would be saying, don't ever go see a psychiatrist, or don't ever change your lifestyle, or don't ever think about things differently, right? But they're saying, if we want to understand the medication, we kind of have to not look at that other stuff right now. That's a way of excluding it rather than denying it. Let me kind of recap. This is really kind of a way of repeating a lot of what we've talked about here based off of C.S. Lewis. And I hope this doesn't advance on me. But C.S. Lewis wrote an essay that kind of covers a lot of the things that we've been talking about in a really nice way. I'd mentioned this YouTube channel before, but there's a YouTube channel called C.S. Lewis Doodle. And basically, you have somebody that reads a C.S. Lewis essay and a guy who draws out what C.S. Lewis was talking about. There is an 11-minute video of meditation in a tool shed on that channel. It is great. It's really good. I'd encourage you to watch it and to listen to it at some point. But in meditation in a tool shed, what C.S. Lewis talks about is that he had to go out into his garden shed. And he went in there and the door closed behind him. And he was like, the most striking thing in the whole shed was this beam of light that was coming in through a crack above the door. And I could kind of stand back and I could see how long that beam of light was. And I could see how wide it was. And I could see the little specks of dust floating around inside of the beam. But then I moved. And I moved so that instead of looking at the beam, the light hit my eyes and I looked along it. And all of a sudden, I couldn't see the tool shed anymore. And all of a sudden, I couldn't see the specks of dirt. And I couldn't measure the light. But I saw the trees outside. And I saw the sky. And I saw the sun. And he's like, I got two radically different pictures. One by looking at the thing, and the other one by looking along it, looking along the beam and seeing what was outside. And he says, you can see that everywhere in the world. He's like, you have a mathematician. And what is it that the mathematician is doing? They're contemplating eternal, timeless, non-physical truths. 2 + 2 = 4. That was true. That's always true. Whether our physical world existed or not, if you deleted the Earth, if you deleted all the stars, if you deleted the galaxy, 2 + 2 would still equal 4. It's an eternal, timeless truth. That's what she's doing. But if you had a scientist who was looking at her and had all these probes up to her brain, right? He would say, oh, this number of neurons fired, this stuff went on. It happens in time and it happens in space. And he wouldn't see anything eternal. And he wouldn't see anything timeless, right? Or if you think about a guy that's in love with a girl, right? And he thinks about how beautiful and how wonderful she is, right? A psychologist that is looking at the guy might start talking about what biological functions are going on and how much oxytocin is being released in his brain, right? Those sorts of things. The picture of value and beauty instantly disappears and another picture takes place. Or the same thing is true of like a little girl who has a doll and it breaks and she cries, right? And she feels like she's lost a real friend. And a psychiatrist might be sitting back looking at her, talking about how she has she wants to be a mother, that all women are born with this like maternal instinct and her maternal instinct has been frustrated. And that's what's going on. And then C.S. Lewis kind of asks, he's like, so you get these two different pictures. He's like, which one is the correct one? Which one is the right one? And his answer is, it depends. You cannot just assume one is right and the other one is wrong. Both at times are right, both at times are wrong, right? Take the example of the guy. Maybe you've known like a friend or something who's like, oh, this girl, she's the most wonderful person in the world. And you kind of look at her and they're like, yeah, not really. She's kind of a jerk, and she's not very nice, right? Our inner thoughts can mislead us. Right? We can have feelings that don't match up to reality. There's interesting studies that have been done on like digital versus printed textbooks. And for a long time, they would do studies. And what they found is that consistently students would say, I like digital better. I read digital more. And I learn more from digital textbooks and reading than what I do from printed material. So I have a preference for it. I like it. I interact with it more. I engage more and I retain more and I do better. And they did studies on these people and consistently they interacted with it less. They read less. They retained less and they didn't understand it as well. They did worse on every metric, but they thought that they were doing better. Our feelings can be deceptive, right? We can be like, oh, I was only outside for 5 minutes, and then your wife was like, no, it was like 4 hours. You're like, oh, sorry, right? We lose kind of track of time, right? Our feelings can be misleading. Our internal way of looking at things can be wrong. But the external way of looking at things can be wrong too. And so the main thing is that we want to recognize they all have weaknesses. They all have advantages. Our world is complicated, and we can't just approach it in one single way. We have to look at it along all of these different ways. And sometimes, you know what? Your feelings did mislead you. That girl really isn't very nice. Maybe she's attractive, but she's not nice, and she's not good, right? And you're being misled. And you weren't really outside for 5 minutes or for a short period of time. You're really outside for a long time, right? Those things can be misleading. But at the same time, what's the ultimate picture of reality? It's not a bunch of numbers. It's not a bunch of matter, right? There's real problems with trying to reduce the world to that. There are things like minds. There is more than just the physical world. Right? If we take our alien example again and we tell him all about oxytocin, he's not going to know what love is. There's much more to it than just that. And if you think that's giving you the full picture, then it's very misleading and it's wrong. The two main instances that we have in our culture of reductionism are scientism and relativism. Scientism is just a view that says the universe, that physical, objective part of the world that we talked about, that you can put into a numerical framework, that's the only thing that exists. That's it. And Lewis talks about he wrote that essay, Meditation in the Toolshed, in 1942. And he talks about how the people who look at things, kind of the scientific viewpoint, they've been having their way. Right? He says, if you want to know what religion is about, you don't go to religious people. You go to religious experts, right? If you want to know what it's like to be a mother, you don't go to mothers. You go to psychologists who specialize in looking at mothers, right? If you want to know what it was like to live in 15th century England or whatever, you don't read literature from that period, from the people who lived there, from the people who walked in that. You read a historian who talks about those sorts of things and analyzes the cups that they used. Right? He says the people who look at things have been having their way. That's that scientism, right? And you see that in very heavily in certain branches of like atheism, right? That religion is opposed to science. That's one of the things we'll talk about next week, right? Science is the only game in town. It's a replacement for religion, right? It's a way of trying to reduce the world into fitting into one little box. The other way of doing it is really, I think, a reaction to that. So Lewis writes 80 years ago, and those scientists have been having their way, right? And I think there was an overreaction against that. And it was a way of saying there is no objective world. Everything is subjective. Everything is personal. Everything is private. Whether I'm a man or a woman, you can't tell that. Only I can tell that. You have to ask me. Right? Everything is private. Whether something is right or wrong, that's up for me to determine, or that's up for us to determine. There is no objective answer to that. Nothing is public. Everything is private. That sort of relative attitude is another trend that's very common in our society. What's a good movie? Nobody can say. What's beautiful? Nobody can say. It's up to everybody. There is no right or wrong answer. Right? You see that in our culture. And I think that's an overreaction to this. And again, it has something in common, and that is that it treats the universe as being very simple when it's really complicated. There are personal, private aspects of the universe, but not all of it is that way. There are parts of the world outside of that. And part of the world is open to numerical investigation and is physical and objective, but not all of it is that way. So we really need to avoid reductionism.
Joseph, can I ask a question about, so I don't know a lot about what evolutionists think for sure. I don't. But it seems to me like if you wanted to talk about the physical part, as evolving, you could make some sort of case for that.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of the personal private part evolve, like how does that,
Yeah.
like if, you know, life comes from whatever, nothing, whatever, I don't know. But anyhow, where does our thoughts and feelings and, you know, how does that, where did that start? How does that begin? And that kind of, to me, if, if, if it was a true science, wouldn't you have to account for that?
Yes.
Along with this idea that stuff just happens and. And so it seems like in today's world where what you're saying is everything is based on feeling.
Mm.
To me, that would even be a death sentence for evolutionists.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's like, well, anyhow, I just was thinking about that in here.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. There's a big fight kind of, and it's really the philosophy of science. And one of the things that has happened is because there are all of these people that have stripped God and the immaterial out of the equation. They realize that they've lost knowledge. They've lost the ability to represent things. They've lost minds. You can't develop. Who really was like, the fact that you are a person is an illusion. You're not really a you. You don't exist. You just think that you exist. And you're gonna, even if I'm confused, isn't there still a I that is confused?
Yeah,
Right, you know, and there's people that think like, oh, science, we got to give it up. It does not accurately represent the world. It's just people's ways of thinking, right? And you lose science. There's the list that I gave out, the suggested reading list. I think a couple people came in late. If you didn't get a slip, let me know and I'll give you one. There's a book on it by G.K. Chesterton, and it's called The Everlasting Man. And he actually talks about that in the first chapter of the book. And one of the things that he points out is he's like, all right, let's say that like evolution is true, and we look at animals and we have like simple to more complicated to more and more and more and more and more complicated. Okay, let's accept all of that. He's like, let's look at people. And you have cavemen that draw animals. Do we find monkeys that were like, well, they drew other animals, but they were pretty crummy, you know? They didn't have very good art, but they did have some, right? There's nothing like that. There is all of a sudden this massive jump forwards. All of a sudden, people are using tools, using art, looking at beauty, having a self-identity and awareness. There is absolutely nothing like that beforehand. There is zero progress there. There is zero development. There is zero evolution. It is all of a sudden, boom, on the scene, fully fledged. How do you account for that? Right? And that's kind of, he does that with a couple things. He then does that with religion, and is like the Christian religion does the same sort of thing. And Jesus does the same sort of thing. All of a sudden, you have this person who does these things that no other person ever did, that no other person would ever dream of saying, right? How do you account for that? That's kind of the outline of the book. But at this point, I've actually partially succeeded in my promise from 4 weeks ago or whatever. And I've ended with like 8 minutes left. So my plan all along has been to leave time for like question and answers, to do it kind of like, you know, a movie, like you come to a class, you watch a movie, and then you talk about it. It's been for me to yap and then for us to kind of converse about it. So this is the first time that I've actually fulfilled that promise. So anybody else, any thoughts, anything that you want to say? Oh, maybe hand these out. I think, Wanda, you need one. Oh, you got one? Was it just you?
You had mentioned that most animals are born independent or very quickly independent.
Mm-hmm.
And that babies, human babies, are not. Did you learn that from a book, or is that an experience?
It was an experiment that I ran.
I'm gonna ask you about the love thing. I forget the answer.
Yeah.
You know, I don't want to do that, but anyhow, this really, I really appreciate what you're doing here, because it, like, I think most of us have this sort of feeling that, you know, this is just fundamentally wrong and this is fundamentally right, but how do I know that?
Yeah.
How do I put words to it? And I really appreciate this idea of just understanding how that comes about, and thinking of, I guess you'd say real science, you know, true
Yeah.
science, you know, without a finger on the scale.
Mhm.
You know, that's the thing that we're so everything, you know, there's a finger on the scale.
Yeah.
And it just puts a bias in society that you really have to fight against. I can't imagine for to teach and to try to avoid that, you know, jump that people are just, you know, undo that thinking that we all are subject to 20, however long we're not asleep. We're
Yeah.
subject to it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm glad it's helpful.
One of the things that my major professor, when I was doing my undergraduate work in American literature, said, read with the perception that you can be part of the problem or part of the solution.
Mhm.
Because he said, if you only see yourself as part of the problem, you're not going to get the rest of the story.
Mhm.
But if you see yourself as part of the solution, you'll understand the problem and your ability to impact it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. If I followed that right, yeah, I think that it is, or maybe the application that I'll try and make from that is that, one of the things that I hope from this class isn't that all of you are going to be like, well, I got to go get a PhD in the humanities and the sciences and the arts. No, right? But that, like, one, you'll have some basic understanding of those things, of their value and their importance and how they work. And also maybe that you will find some area that you're interested. You'll see some sort of problem and you'll think, I want to learn more about that. And I can do that. That's interesting to me. You know, oh, that's sort of an interesting puzzle. That's an area of the world that I would like to go and to understand better. And that's part of living out that commission that God gave to Adam, to go and to have dominion of the world. What's the area that you're called to have dominion over? Right? What's an area that you can learn about and that you can then help others, you know, with that? Maybe it is agriculture, you know, maybe it's something in literature. Maybe it's something with children's education. Maybe it's something in philosophy, right? But yeah, that's my hope, is that it will help kind of stir us to wanting to be part of the solution.
You know, we read some stuff in scripture, it's kind of like, I'm sorry, what's being said here? You know,
Yeah.
and I think, and it's interesting to me because, right, Jesus, so the total of man's wisdom is garbage, right? Compared to, it's just foolishness to the Lord. So what you're teaching us to the Lord is just this base, you know, it's you just walk on it, you know, it's just foolishness.
Yeah.
So Jesus comes and knowing, you know, everything, has to try to tell us about truth.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, I think about, like, we have a new puppy, and it's kind of like he loves to eat crabgrass and gravel. So if you take him out, you know, first thing he does is he knows now, and now just within a week, he knows where that all is in the yard, you know, and he's heading that way, and it's kind of like, no, don't eat crabgrass and gravel. We've got good food in here for you. You know? But he doesn't get that. He
Yeah.
just looks at you with that blank stare, like, no, I like crabgrass and I like gravel. Now let me
Yeah.
have it. And, so I just think about how frustrating it had to be sometimes
Mhm.
for the Lord to kind of, and still, look at
Yeah.
us, we're just looking at him with those blank stare.
Yeah.
Like, what? What do you want me to do?
Yeah. Yeah, and we kind of see again like two interesting mistakes. One of trying to think and understand things independently of God,
Yeah.
right? And the other one is just not doing it at all, right? And just giving it up. And like really what God has called us to do is to realize, yeah, your understanding is pretty crummy and it's nothing, but let me work with you and let me help you. Right. And for us to develop those things as far as we can and as far as we're able. And God gives us different abilities. He gives us different callings. He gives us different interests. And we need to recognize that and account for that. But we also need to engage and to develop to the extent that we're called to do. And again, I think one of those kind of like anti-intellectual things was just a tendency to just give it up. This is hard. How do we account for that? How do we do this? Well, it's all evil. It's all bad, and we're going to go off by ourselves. And then we don't have to deal with these problems, because dealing with problems is hard. That's why they're called problems. So, yeah.
Yeah, but you had Proverbs, right? Seek wisdom, right? We're
Yeah.
encouraged all through scripture to get
Yeah.
an understanding,
Yeah.
right? And make every effort and on all
Mhm.
this and renew our minds.
Yeah.
And then, but only once, I think, do we see kind of this idea where Paul says, right now I see as in a mirror.
Oh, yeah.
In a bad mirror, whatever.
Yeah.
But there'll be a day when I see him face to face. Well, then all of a sudden,
Yeah.
right, all of these things are like, oh my,
Yeah.
it's like when, you think, well, when I was 2, I like to eat rocks too, and it's
Yeah.
like, well, that's about them,
Yeah.
really, I'm just saying. But I don't think. But anyhow, you know what I mean? It's
Yeah,
like this, there's this revelation waiting for us.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, seek all of that we can now. Do all we can to understand and to obey God. But there's going to be a moment when we're going to see him face to face.
Yeah.
And all of this will just be gone. Will just be,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that thought. And we're a little past time, so I'll close out. Thanks again. And I'll hopefully see y'all next week.